inspiring change. Poetically inspiring change for life, joy, peace in your body.
Everybody must wear a mask. Before pandemic, I wore a mask to block strong fragrance, the smell of gas, strong cleaning agents for soiled tasks. Now everybody must wear a mask. Snap, 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 snap. Hello, y'all. I'm Angela Braxton Johnson, your host for this podcast called Poetically Inspiring Change, where I use poetry, my faith, and stories to inspire Black joy, intersectional healing, and diet culture recovery. So thanks so much for tuning in. I started out in this mask today because I want to talk today about disabilities, specifically invisible disabilities, and even more specifically, fragrance sensitivities, which is something that I've suffered with for many, many years, all my life actually. So before I go too far into that, I just want people to understand that when I talk about intersectional healing, it comes from the whole idea of intersectionality, which is when people have levels of oppression based on their identities. So somebody can have somebody that's in a black or brown body. That could be one level of discrimination or oppression. Someone who's older, someone who's in a bigger body or fat. I like to embrace the word fat. If you don't worry about it. That's just, you do you and I'll do me. This is a weight inclusive space as much as possible anyway. I'll try not to step on any toes, but it's not going to be a perfect space because I'm here. It could be dealing with different health issues or disabilities, part of what we're going to talk about tonight. It could be, there's so many. Oh, it could be your sex, your gender. It could be your sexual preference, whether LGBTQIA plus. It could be so many different things that cause layers of oppression. So dealing with one of those things can be a lot. Dealing with one intersection can be a lot. When you're dealing with multiple stacked on top of each other, that just expands the level of oppression and stress and anxiety and all of the things that can come with really stressful, hard times. So I was born with bronchitis. I'm using air quotes for those who are listening, bronchitis. And actually, I know now that I was really born with asthma. But because I was a child receiving government, state assisted medical benefits, we didn't get the best of care. I didn't get the best of care. They didn't put a lot of time and analysis into figuring out what was wrong in Black bodies, especially poor Black bodies. I'm just going to share stories tonight or today, whenever you're listening to this. So this story I wrote, sometimes you've got to leave in order to breathe. Sometimes you've got to leave in order to breathe. Peep how leaving my home church was the beginning of my body trust reclamation and liberation journey. From my earliest memory, I always loved God and going to church. I loved the experience of getting dressed, wearing our Sunday best clothes, and going to a place where we would learn, sing, fellowship, eat, and worship in community. Whenever folks got dressed up, they also got sprayed up with their favorite perfumes. And honey child, I'm saying when they spray, spray, even mama used to spray when she sprayed her perfume. She'd spray kind of all over her body. Sometimes she'd spray in her hair, possible. If you ever hear any of Maya Angelou's talks or poems, you know what possible is. So people also would get all sprayed up when they got dressed up. It seemed that only a few church members would wear their scents modestly, and even though I liked mildly scented perfumes, strong scents gave me migraines. Now, I want to pause there in the story and just say that when I was a child, I had a lot of sickness and allergies, asthma, but I didn't know that's what it was. My family members didn't know that's what it was. So for a large part of my early life, I basically suffered in silence, especially after being in foster care, where when I would get sick, I'd get in trouble, or my aunt would get angry because I was also the caretaker of my baby sister, which I love that I have that experience that was one of the reasons we were able to stay in the same home together, is that I helped take care of her. But when I would get sick, my aunt would get really upset. And so I'll go back into the story and I'll pause again, and you'll understand why in a moment. I first became severely scent sensitive when I was 10 years old, living in foster care. My aunt sold Avon, and my bedroom was where she stored all of her scented products, including lots of bottles with strong fragrances. That room is where I hung out. I used to read. I used to write in my little journal, and so spent time in there, a lot of time in there. I learned in that home and from being sexually abused years before that it wasn't safe for me to express how I felt, especially when I was sick, which was often, because doing so usually resulted in me getting in trouble. So I only told my god sister and close friend. I learned that sharing when I was sick, I learned that when I was in foster care, this was not a thing when I was with my mother. When I was with my mother, if I told mama I'm sick or something, mama's on it. She's taking care of it. She's taking care of me. But this was an experience that happened in foster care. But I was 10 years old. So that was at a time that really shaped how, I interacted, and in order to be safe, I just, kept things to myself. Then I say fast forward 25 years fast forward, but then I go back. From the age of 15, I attended and diligently served in ministry for over 20 years when our church was forced to move due to rising gentrification via eminent domain. Shortly after we moved into this new church building, my reactions to fragrance gradually became more pronounced, to the point of me gagging and running outside to keep from vomiting. This happened whenever I got close to really fragrant folks, and sometimes just upon entering the building. Now, what you should know is about the building, the way where our church was, when you first enter the building, as soon as you walk in, there was a front door that was like on the side, on the corner, but we didn't usually go in that door. We usually went in the side door, which when you go in, there's some glass doors. As soon as you go in, to the right, there's some stairs that go down to a basement. And when you go down to that basement, there's a closet that stored lots of paints and fuels and, like chemically laden, heavily laden toxic stuff in that closet right downstairs. And then when you first come in, to your left, right there on the same level, there was a janitor's closet, and you could smell the like pine sol, bleach, detergent. There was always a really strong smell coming from that space. And it took me a minute to realize that when I came in, like I would come to church, and like a few minutes later, I'd be feeling really sick. Well, I would have just walked through this kind of toxic air zone, really polluted space, walk through that, and then I'd go up the stairs and into the sanctuary where there would be multiple people, oftentimes, also wearing fragrance. So it was the chemicals, all of that on top of the fragrances. So I just wanted to explain that. I had no idea that my breathing was under attack when all of those things were happening. Mama called fragrance smell goods, and most folks wore theirs layered with scented soaps, body sprays, lotions, and aftershave. For some, that was on top of unsuccessfully masked cigarette smoke by smokers dousing themselves with fragrance right after smoking and right before entering church. Now, let me just say, if you smoke, y'all, if you smoke, just let the regular air just, like air out your smoke. Fragrance does not hide your smoke. You just end up smelling like smoke on top of fragrance. And I'm not putting down anyone that smokes. I'm just saying that when you try to cover it up with fragrance, it doesn't work. It doesn't cover it up. And for somebody like me, then I'm also dealing with fragrance on top of smoke, which is also an irritant. So, breathing became such a problem for me. Again, this was 20 years later from when I was a child. I started asking my brothers and sisters in Christ to please not wear so much fragrance. I even proposed that they consider coming to church fragrance free, which was not well received. Most members thought that my request was ridiculous. Mother Irvin would say ridiculous, and would not comply even after witnessing my severe reactions. Now, at this point, again, I just knew they were severe reactions. I did not know why. But, and it also, I remember in November of 2004, that year being the year that I started having like these repetitive asthma attacks. I found out later they were asthma attacks, but I didn't know for a while that's what that was. Some even got offended and angry at me because of my sickness. My sickness had become an inconvenience for them. This also goes back to the little girl me, that 10-year-old me, that 11-year-old me, that 12-year-old me in foster care, who, when I got sick, I basically would get in trouble, or, like reprimanded, cussed out, whatever, because, now somebody got to take off work to come see about me, take me to ER. I would get hives all over my body really bad. Well, I'm sleeping in a room full of Avon, and y'all, this is Avon from the 1970s, okay? It had a lot of the fragrances, besides being chemically laced or having a lot of chemicals in them, some of the common chemicals included formaldehyde. And I don't know the other word. I know it starts with a T, but chemicals that were strong. Formaldehyde used to embalm dead bodies. These kinds of things were in fragrance that people are, putting all over their bodies. So there was that. So people getting angry with me when I was an adult, like I remember getting sick and apologizing. Like here I am struggling to breathe and I'm apologizing to the person that feels inconvenient. I'd be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Because people would come close to me and I'd start backing away and they'd be looking at me like, "What's going on?" And I'd be like, "I'm so sorry. Something you're wearing I'm reacting. I'm reacting to it." Yeah, some people got pretty ticked off about that. Interestingly, they still urge me to faithfully show up, to serve them and Jesus with my many talents. They affirmed that they were believing God for my healing. They were willing to pray, but unwilling to accommodate me. They were willing to pray, but unwilling to accommodate me. This was a hard pill to swallow since church was my primary affinity space. Church leaders told me that my sickness would be healed if I believed God. I believed God. I know that God is a healer. I've seen God work miracles in my life. I'll talk about this in a future episode, but I just want to mention that from my childhood, there's a lot of witnessing of miracles. One, when I was 10 years old, the thing that got me in the foster care was our house had caught on fire because my mother had had a bipolar episode, and this is before bipolar was bipolar. It was called manic depression. I'm using air quotes. People who were manically depressed. They talked about the mania being real high highs, and then the depression they would experience low lows, and so through a series of events, which I'll talk about in the future, our house was caught on fire and we were stranded on the roof. I prayed, as because Mama said pray. I prayed, and within minutes, and I mean just a few minutes after praying, God sent three people down the street to rescue us. It was on a Saturday, y'all. It was usually people were outside playing. Wasn't nobody outside playing that day. Anyway, just letting you know that I knew that God was real because right after I prayed, and even Mama not being in her best state of mind, she wasn't in a well state of mind at that point, she still knew to pray. She still knew to call on God. And she taught me to call on God. And I did. And God came through. So much so. And when God comes through, a lot of times, and whoever you call your higher power, I call mine God, Jesus, Holy Spirit. When God comes through, he makes sure that you know that this I am God. Like I did this. When those people came to rescue us afterwards, you know what they said, what they told the adults? They told the adults that they had taken a wrong turn. It was three white people in a Jeep on a Saturday in December, but it was kind of odd when I think about it because they had a Jeep with the top down, but they had two white men and a white woman, and the three of them, I remember they drove up on the yard. Like they saw the house burning, they saw us up on the roof. Me and my baby sister were up on the roof, and anyway, I knew that God was real because Mama said pray, and I prayed, and then within minutes God showed up with, had some people take the so-called wrong turn, and they became our rescuers. So I knew and know that God is real. I know that God is a healer. I know that God can heal me right now, today. And I believe that if it's his will, he will do it. And I also know that sometimes God doesn't heal people. And people don't want to talk about that, but that is a reality. Sometimes people are not healed on this side of heaven. They're healed, on the other side when they get their perfect bodies, their holy, their spiritual bodies. Part of my belief. You may not believe that, but that's part of what I believe. Church leaders told me that my sickness would be healed if I believed God. Yet I believed God, and still I wasn't healed after years and years and years. That thing had become a thorn in my flesh. Some leaders and members stated that my sickness was only in my head. But isn't my head also in my body? Spiritual leaders, including my husband at the time, since we were both brainwashed in so many ways back then, encouraged me to, quote, stay faithful to God through my service in the church, end quote. And that is where I got sick every Sunday. In my service to God, every Sunday, I got sick. I'd come to church feeling relatively well, sometimes all the way well. And I'd leave church with a migraine, feeling sick, and all the symptoms of respiratory distress. So I did. I stayed. I stayed, ignoring my body's screaming request for air and its basic need to breathe. I hadn't learned yet how to trust my body. I hadn't learned yet how to trust my body. And so you know, body trust is about a deep listening to your body. It's about knowing and trusting your body. If your body says, I'm hungry, that you're hungry instead of trying to psych yourself out about hunger and restricting because you're trying to alter your body size or something like that. Um, it's trusting that if your body needs rest, that you rest. It's trusting that if your body says, "Oh, I've had enough," then you've had enough. You know, learning to trust the body, learning to listen. Now, for me, body trust, I am a body trust provider, and you can learn more if you go to the centerofbodytrust.com. And they also wrote a book, the founders, Dana and Hillary. They wrote a book, and I got to be in the book where I share part of my body story. I also share a couple of poems. I woke up like that and She Majestic Tree. Also, it's in this little plug for Body Trust. It's also in the Audible book. I'm actually reading my words. So I hadn't learned to trust my body yet. I learned I was still in this place of people pleasing, doing what other people told me to do, trying to be a good person and trying to keep the peace. And yeah, and also I believe a lot of that stems, as I read earlier, from my experience of child abuse, sexual and physical child abuse at such a young age that I that was at at the ages of 3 and 4 I learned um, to mask how I felt, to not tell anyone, because telling could get me in trouble. And certainly the foster care situation made that true. And even at church, for me to say that, here I'm in my 20s and 30s, and for me to say I'm getting sick, it was just it just caused a lot of stress because people either didn't believe me, or they didn't like the fact that I was inconveniencing them by asking them to do something that they didn't want to do. And I get it, because wearing fragrance is part of people's grooming. So my sickness became so intense, folks avoided getting close to me, still unwilling to reduce or eliminate their fragrance a few hours on Sunday. I felt so alone and isolated, and usually ended up leaving to sit in my car. Eventually, I started going to the knit shop around the corner, knitting in the space where I could breathe until church let out. So I'd go to church with my husband and my children. I'd go to church. I'd get sick. I tried not to get sick. I tried like to will myself, like, I'm not going to get sick. And I'd get sick. And I just walk around the corner, and I think the knit shop was Naked Sheep, the Naked Sheep knit shop. Um, and I go in there and I just, I take my knitting with me, and I just go there and sit and knit until church was over. That was one of my escapes. And at that point, I was still doing the people pleasing because I was still showing up at church. And I come from a background that teaches women to submit to their husbands, and that is not wrong. Husbands also submit to their wives. Go into Ephesians, you'll see. But because my husband wanted me to stay or try to go, this was how he felt then. This is not how he feels now. Then I did. And also the leaders in the church expected me to show up. So I did. Years later, I was referred to an allergy asthma specialist. This was in 2008, who tried various treatments on me, and they weren't working. And she said either I had asthma. Well, I had asthma, period. But I have the kind of asthma that the environment can make things work, like the fragrance make things worse, not work. So having the type of respiratory sensitivity that the environment affected and made it worse. So, like I said, walking into a space where there's chemicals on one side, chemicals on the other side, being exposed to all those chemicals, being in a home where mama used pine sol and bleach and all of those things, And you walk into a house, and in my community, if you walk into a house and it smelled like pine salt, that was a good sign. That meant that house was clean, you know. And Mama did keep a clean house, but those smells were those they made me sick. I almost always had a headache, and I didn't know why. That allergy asthma doctor, she's so amazing. She's so amazing. Um, She did a bunch of treatments, and she wanted to give me the shot treatments. But when she tested me for shot treatments, and this happened for years, my body was too inflamed to take shots. And that's saying a lot. And then she said to me, and at this point, I realized I had asthma. I didn't, I think that was when I learned that I had asthma. So I had been having asthma attacks for some years before I realized they were asthma attacks, which is crazy. And I'm super grateful that, those asthma attacks didn't take me out. Um, but this is what she said. She said, Angela, at this point, you need to listen to your body. There must be something toxic inside that building. My body was letting me know that that was not a safe space. My body was letting me know that was not a safe space for me. And I believe that was not a safe space for many others who probably suffered in silence or didn't even realize, like if they were children, like when I was 10, I didn't know that being in that fragrant room of, in my aunt's home, my uncle and aunt's home, but in my aunt's room, because they were married, but she had her own room and he had his own room. And and when we stayed with her, they shared rooms. So the room that we slept in, like I didn't know that all of those fragrances were making me sick. I just know I had a lot of times where I had to go to ER, where I got hives all over my body, where they were trying to treat me with calamine lotion and oatmeal baths and all kinds of things that did not work. So I knew that she was right. And I wrote a letter to the pastor because at this point it had just gotten, I think I started actually getting treatment from her in 2007. 2008 is when I remember was when I wrote the letter to our pastor. And I said to him, and after a lot of thinking about this, after talking to my husband about it, and just tired of years of being sick every single week, I wrote a letter to the pastor that I was leaving that church where I was married, the church where I raised my kids. All of my kids were born, had served there at more than 30 years at that point. I was leaving so I could breathe. My pastor rebuked me, not supporting my decision. And though my husband said he supported me, my husband remained at the church for some time after I left by myself. Now, when I left, my children wanted to leave with me. Um, it was my boys at that time because my daughter was grown and already worshiping at another ministry. And so my boys wanted to leave because they knew how sick I got. Like they lived with me and they saw that after Sundays going to church, their mom was always sick. Like I got worse from going to church. And they didn't like the treatment and they actually wanted to come with me when I said I was leaving the church. And because I was, being the people pleaser that I was and trying to keep the peace and all of that, I encouraged my boys to stay. Alvin was playing keys, Lex was on drums, um, and so Alexander, or AJ, is what most of his friends call him, or Alex, and my son Alvin, they were the musicians at the church at the time. So I didn't want to, like, I felt like I was already rocking the boat and I didn't want to rock the boat anymore in my favor. So I encouraged them to stay. And they didn't like it, but they did stay with their dad. So how isolating is that? I'm leaving a church by myself while my family, continues to worship there. That was a hard thing to do, but trusting my body, that was not a popular decision. Um, but it was what I needed to do in order to breathe. My new church, filled with folks who didn't know me, accommodated me right away. When I, you know how when you first go to a church and people are like, oh yeah, I know such and such. Like there were a lot of people at that church that were from a lot of churches around the city. It was like this church was filled with, I don't know, I guess a lot of people looking for something different. So when I first went to that church, they welcomed me with open arms. And when they asked why I left, I said, well, I left my church because I couldn't breathe there anymore. I was having a hard time breathing. And right away, the minister said, we will accommodate you. They made announcements. They told people, we have a sister who is sick, and other that who gets more sickened by fragrance, and people wearing fragrances, especially when it's a room full of people wearing fragrances. Um, and so they asked people to not wear fragrance, and so that lasted for some time, and then after a while, they would make announcements because new people are coming and going. It's a church, people are always coming and going, and they made announcements quite frequently initially. And then after a while, it kind of tapered down, and it tapered down some more, and it tapered down some more. And eventually, nobody said anything, and the rooms began to become fragrant again. So, a few years following my exodus, and I'm just going to say this happened at that church. After that church closed down, um, this was in 2015. We learned that our ministry was going to be like shifting, transitioning. So in 2016, in October, I believe, September maybe, September or October, the fall of 2016, um, that church ended up closing, and people went out into different ministries. And my husband was part of the pastoral staff at the time, and we were actually really thinking about just starting a ministry and doing like a fragrance-free ministry because at that point I had so many people that would talk to me and say, thank you for saying something. I suffer with the same thing, but so many people with invisible disabilities suffer in silence, and sometimes when they aren't silent, people don't like it. Like I said, with my experience, some people actually got an attitude, or they'd say stuff like, Angela, stay away, like don't come close. Do you know how isolating it is to have a condition that people don't want to hug you? Like people are saying, no, no, stay back. Like, no, don't come close because I'm wearing fragrance. So they know that they're wearing fragrance and that I can't come close, which means I can't hug people. I can't make connections, like, you know, get close to people. There were very few people that would actually, in my old church, I'm talking about the first one, where people would actually stop wearing fragrance. So this happened over the course of a few years, no, several years, where we'd join the church and they'd have the fragrance free thing, and it kind of lasts for a while and then it phases out. And what I know today is that, people wearing fragrance is part of their grooming. I mean, people want to smell good. Fragrance is not a bad thing. It's the overuse of fragrance, and there's so many other things in our environment too that makes the breathability of air like more challenging if you're dealing with invisible allergies or invisible disabilities. I just want to read what is defined as a disability. A disability is a condition that a person has which limits them in some way. These conditions may be congenital, present at birth, cognitive, associated with the brain, developmental, appears as the person develops and ages, and physical, which can be caused by an accident or infection. Invisible disabilities or hidden disabilities are disabilities that are not immediately obvious. You can't look at me and tell that I'm allergic to fragrances. You can't look at me and tell that I have asthma. You can't, it's not, and if I were using a cane, or if I had a disability that I'm using a walker, you can look at me and tell, oh, that person may need some support. Let me go help them. Let me accommodate them. But people who have invisible disabilities, and I'm going to read about what some of those are. So, some hidden disabilities are disabilities that are not immediately obvious, such as intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, mental disorders, which, if you like dealing with like eating disorders and that kind of thing, that's still a mental disorder, asthma, epilepsy, allergies, migraines, arthritis, and chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, those are just some that are listed here. This is not, there could be more, but these are some of the most common things. I have multiple things on this list. So, and again, I was born with asthma. So, people dealing with invisible disabilities, it's not easy to look at them and know that they're dealing with that. But what I want to really encourage people to consider is that when someone voices it to you, especially people in the household of faith, like you have the opportunity to love someone well by accommodating them. So if you know that this person gets sick wearing fragrance, is it really that big of an issue to not wear fragrance for 2 or 3 hours of a day? Because I mean, we're not hanging. I'm at my house most of the time. I'm not. We don't live at church. At one point, it felt like we lived at church because we were there almost 7 days a week, but that's not the case anymore. So it's a sacrifice, sure, but is it really a big sacrifice compared to what is gained by being in community and being able to be close and give hugs and to just show someone love? That is such a much more amazing thing to experience. One of the things I say, a few years following my exodus, this is after the first church that I left, and this is a true story, y'all. A few years following my exodus, men in hazmat suits had to clean up many pounds of toxic waste inside the church where my family and I spent more time than most. We were usually one of the first ones to get to the church, most of the time opening up the church. My husband was a deacon and an elder, and a minister of music there, and we served. I taught Sunday school. I worked with children's church. I worked on the third level, which was right under the floor where where there were pounds and pounds of toxic waste just sitting there festering. That's what I was breathing in on a regular basis on Sundays, on Wednesday nights when I was teaching the youth Bible study class. And, so the fact that men in hazmat suits had to clean up many pounds of toxic waste inside the church where my family and I spent more time than most. My sensitive body was right and could most definitely be trusted. This here sensitive body was right and telling me this was not a good space for me to be in. Leaving that church, which also held many good memories, so many good memories, so many good memories. I mean, oh my gosh. I mean, that could be like a whole multiple series in a podcast. I mean, it's where my husband and I got married, but way before him, it's like one of my best friends, Sister Meady. I met her at that church. It was so incredible to meet a female musician in the church because that wasn't always that played something. Like, she played the organ. I love the organ. She played the organ, and it was common to see someone who played the piano but not playing the organ. So yeah, we started being friends right after that. On another episode where I actually want to interview her, we'll talk about some of the funny things that happened before we became friends. So I could trust this body. My body was right. And it took me some years and decades even to learn to listen to this here body. So I'm gonna read a poem. This poem is called Just go clean and fragrance free so everyone can breathe. When you go to public places like shopping, school, church, or work, when you're going to the doctors because you're sick, confused, or hurt, when you go to party hardy, do your dance, have fun, or twerk, just go clean and fragrance free so that everyone can breathe. When folks wear so much smell goods that their own strong fragrance lurks in the room after they leave, that's just too much and so berserk. Corporate overuse of scents creates a toxic, smelly murk. Just go clean and fragrance free so that everyone can breathe. Not accommodating folks, though with a smile, some with a smirk, when the folks they claim to love they ignore, forget, and hurt. Because they wear too much perfume, yet the offender becomes irked. Just go clean and fragrance free so that everyone can breathe. Loving friends and family well, this should be praised and never shirked. A small sacrifice to some, for those affected, a huge perk. Being in community is the divine's loving framework. So just go clean and fragrance free so that everyone can breathe. Snap, 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 snap. I really want to strongly encourage you. If you know people, most people listening to this podcast, if it's not you that has the fragrance sensitivity, you know someone who has it. I have friends who now have fragrance sensitivities that didn't used to have fragrance sensitivities. I also know that if we're being sensitive to Holy Spirit, if we're being sensitive to the Spirit, and just even if you don't believe in God, just being sensitive to someone and their needs, I believe Holy Spirit will help us to remember. Now, I have an example. A good friend of mine, good sister friend of mine. I know she won't mind me calling her name. Her name is Sharina. Sharina did not used to have fragrance sensitivities, not to the extent that I did, but she has it more today. But I remember there was a time where whenever she knew that, because at one point I hired her to do some work in my childcare because she's so good and organized and just a great, excellent trainer. If you do childcare and you need some training, call Next Level Ministries. I remember one day she told me she was on her way. She knew that she was going to be coming over to my house, and she didn't even think about it. But then she went to put on her perfume, and the Holy Spirit stopped her. And so I'm like, we serve that same God. Like, if that Holy Spirit can stop her, then it could stop me or the next person or even you, right? And there was another time she told me where she was always intentional about not wearing fragrance when she knew she was going to be with me. This one day, she didn't know that we didn't know we were going to end up in the same room together. That one day she went to put on her fragrance and then she felt led not to. Now I'm like, what kind of God do we serve? She went to put on her fragrance and felt led not to. And then later when she saw me, she said, "Girl, let me tell you, God is something else because I had no idea I was going to see you today. And I went to put on my fragrance and I felt led, not like she told me the story." And so when we're intentional about things, that can bring about change. I love the church that we attend right now. People are intentional there about like really being sensitive. What I know is that sometimes people really do forget because it's been decades of grooming. But I also know that I have to listen to my body and I have to make sure that I'm keeping my body safe. So I encourage you to do the same. If you deal with invisible disabilities, I encourage you to speak up and let people know. Trust your body. If your body is telling you you need to do something different, sometimes you have to leave in order to breathe. That's the story that I read. sometimes you have to leave the environment. Like right now, sometimes I've had to leave outside of my house. Like, there's a gas leak, or sometimes my husband would clean or do something and he didn't realize it was so strong, and I'm going outside. Sometimes outside is a toxic space to be in. So, um, so I want to, before I end, I want to talk about a few things. I have this mask that I had on at the beginning, and when you have an N95, this is something that can help block the fragrance, but it doesn't take all the fragrance away. So I brought a few other things that can help people who deal with fragrance sensitivities like I do. So I keep a bottle of peppermint in my purse. I keep some in my car. My peppermint oil, even though peppermint is really strong, I can tolerate peppermint, and I can tolerate a lot of essential oils because they're not laced with chemicals. But in excess, it can be too much. So when I know I'm going to be in a public place, a lot of times I'll just take a little bit of the oil and I'll just put it right under my nose, just a little bit. So now I have that peppermint that is kind of used as a to block other scents. One other thing I wanted to mention that can help people who are dealing with fragrance sensitivities like I deal with. If you have an essential oil or something that's not too strong, because if you're too strong, then you can be offending the next person. And I always ask, when I'm around people, are you okay with peppermint? Because if they're not, then, I'm just sensitive to that. But again, I use the peppermint and having that on and giving it a chance to air out, because if you put peppermint on your nose and then you go right away and put a mask on, those fumes are going to rise up into your eyes. I have experience, and the fumes will burn your eyes. So you kind of have to let it air out, then you can wear a mask. So you can sometimes lace, even like the smell of coffee beans or something like that, having that. The mask helps, but the mask does not stop the fragrance from coming through, especially when you're in a room filled with people. So I just wanted to share that and hope that it's helpful. In addition to that, sometimes I have to use an inhaler. So like this past Sunday, I got really sick at church because, sometimes people come and they don't know, and, just circumstances. Anyway, having an inhaler, this is one of the things that I have to use that helps me to breathe. I don't use it every day because I don't have that kind of asthma. I have the kind of like an allergic type of asthma. This is another thing that I use only in extreme emergencies. It's an EpiPen. Generally, people don't walk around with EpiPens if they don't have severe allergies. I keep an EpiPen in my purse. I have gone into anaphylaxis at least twice. I don't want to ever experience that again. I hope I never experience that again. But thank God for the medicines that we have available, because that they truly saved my life. I know God saved my life ultimately, and God gave people the wisdom to create the medicine. So learn to, try to sense, be in your body, try to listen to your body, and trust that when your body tells you that something is not safe for you, trust that, and then do what you need to do to preserve yourself. This is beyond self-care. This is self-preservation. So I hope you got something out of this. You most likely know somebody. If it's not you, you know somebody who has those sensitivities. Pay attention to them, listen to them, believe them, and go fragrance free just for the time that you're around them. Okay. All right, y'all, have a good night, a good day, or whatever time it is when you hear this. And thank you so much for joining me today. Mwah. Bye, y'all.